The city was wide awake, even though the clock on the dashboard had already ticked past the hour when most people should be sleeping. It was one of those crisp, cool Tuesdays that feels heavy with silence, yet the urban streets were still buzzing with the distant hum of traffic and the flickering of neon signs. The streets were damp from a rain that had passed through an hour earlier, making the pavement shine under the streetlights like black glass. In the middle of this quiet chaos, a single car was moving smoothly down the avenue, blending in perfectly with the flow of the night. Behind the wheel sat a man who the whole world knew, yet at this specific moment, nobody recognized. He was tired in a way that goes beyond just needing sleep. It was the kind of deep exhaustion that settles into your bones after weeks of non-stop work, memorizing lines, performing stunts, and trying to be the person everyone else expects you to be. Tonight, he didn't want to be a movie star. He didn't want to be a face on a poster or a name in the credits. He just wanted to be a human being getting something to eat. He was driving a vehicle that was modest and reliable, the kind of car you would see at any grocery store parking lot. Nothing flashy or screaming for attention. He kept the windows rolled up just enough to let a little bit of the cool air in, but not enough for anyone to peer inside. The air inside the car smelled like old leather and the faint scent of cologne. On the seat next to him lay a worn jacket and a script that he had finally put away for the day. His mind was quiet, which was a rare luxury for him. As he drove, his stomach gave a small, insistent grumble, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything since a light lunch hours ago. He wasn't looking for a 5-star meal or a fancy restaurant where waiters would hover over him and whisper about who he was. He didn't want white tablecloths or background music. He wanted something simple, something greasy, something real. He wanted the comfort of food that didn't pretend to be anything else. Up ahead, a bright set of yellow and red lights pierced the darkness. It was a fast food chain, one of those places that looks exactly the same in every city in every country. The sign glowed like a beacon in the night, promising hot food and no questions asked. He slowed down and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt up over his head, casting a shadow over his face. He adjusted a simple baseball cap, pulling the brim low. He looked like any other guy driving home from a late shift at the office. He looked anonymous. He turned the wheel and guided the car into the entrance of the drive-through lane. There were a few cars ahead of him, and he settled in behind a small sedan with a family eating inside. He watched the taillights in front of him, his hands resting easily on the steering wheel. This was the part of the job nobody talked about: the isolation. When you are famous, people always want a piece of you. They want a photo, a story, or a handshake. But here, in this line of cars waiting for burgers and fries, he was just a vehicle in a queue. He tapped his fingers gently on the steering wheel to the low beat of a classic rock song playing softly on the radio. He watched a young couple walk out of the restaurant, holding hands, laughing about something small. It was a beautiful, normal moment. He soaked it in. These were the moments that kept him grounded. This was real life. The red brake lights of the car in front flickered off as the line moved forward. He inched his car up, the tires crunching softly on the asphalt. Finally, he reached the intercom system. It was a large, weathered metal box with a small speaker, covered in stickers and years of exposure to the elements. He leaned forward and pressed the button, waiting for the crackle of static. A voice came through, sounding distant and a little tired, asking for his order. "Hi, can I get a number 3 please? Just a regular burger with cheese and a medium water," he said. His voice was calm and polite. There was no arrogance, no impatience. It was just a simple request. "Anything else?" the voice asked. "That's all. Thank you," he replied. "Please pull forward to the window." The intercom clicked off. He let out a breath. He didn't realize he was holding. It was a small interaction, a transaction that happens millions of times a day all over the world. But to him, it felt like a victory. He had ordered food. He had spoken to another person. He hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't been asked for an autograph. He was just a hungry guy in a hoodie. He eased the car forward toward the first window. The restaurant was brightly lit inside. Through the glass, he could see the staff moving around. It looked chaotic and hot in there. He saw people running back and forth, grabbing bags, handing drinks, looking at timers on screens. It was a hard job, a job that required a lot of energy and patience, especially late at night when customers might be rude or impatient. He watched the blur of activity with a sense of respect. He knew what it was like to work hard, to be on your feet for hours, to have to smile when you don't feel like it. He felt a sudden pang of gratitude for these people working the late shift so that people like him could get a hot meal when they were hungry. It was easy to ignore the workers behind the glass when all you wanted was food, but he made a point to really see them. The line moved slowly. The car in front of him seemed to be taking a long time. Maybe they were checking their order. He waited patiently, looking out at the dark, empty lot next to the building. The night air was getting colder. He reached over and turned the heat in his car up just a notch. He thought about going home to his empty house, sitting on the couch, and maybe watching a movie or just staring at the wall. It sounded perfect. Eventually, the car in front moved on, and it was his turn. He pulled up to the payment window. He stopped the car and looked for his wallet in the passenger seat, grabbing a few bills from his pocket. He didn't look up at the window immediately. He was just getting his money ready, focused on the simple task of paying. He was in his own world, protected by the metal shell of his car and the shadow of his hood. He was ready to pay, grab his bag, and disappear into the night again. Just another anonymous customer fading into the darkness. But as he lifted his head to hand the money out, he was about to notice something that would change the direction of his entire night. He wasn't the only one who was tired. He wasn't the only one who was struggling. And behind that glass window, a completely different story was unfolding. The glass window of the drive-thru was streaked with rain and fingerprints, a blurry barrier between the cool, quiet night outside and the hot, chaotic world inside. As the window slid open with a mechanical clatter, a wave of noise rushed out to meet the car. There was the sharp hissing of the fryer, the loud beeping of timers that seemed to never stop, and the echo of voices shouting orders over the noise of metal trays clanking together. The smell that drifted through the window was thick and greasy, the scent of fried potatoes and grilled meat mixed with the sharp chemical odor of industrial cleaning fluid. Behind the counter stood a young man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was probably in his early 20s, wearing a uniform that looked a size too big, the collar of his shirt slightly wrinkled and damp with sweat. His name tag was slightly crooked, and his dark hair was matted down under a plastic hat. He looked exhausted, not just the kind of tired you feel after a bad night of sleep, but a deep, heavy weariness that settles in when you have been running on empty for too long. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the skin around them looking pale and thin. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was electric with stress. It seemed like everything was going wrong at once. A manager, a man with a stern face and a headset, was pacing back and forth behind the young cashier, barking out orders about missing sauces and cold fries. The pressure in the air was so thick you could almost touch it. The cashier was trying to focus on the screen in front of him, his fingers hovering over the buttons, but he was flinching every time the manager raised his voice. When the car pulled up, the young cashier turned his attention to the window. He forced a smile, but it was a fragile thing. It didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile you paste on your face when you were paid to be polite, even when you feel like screaming. He reached out a hand to take the money from the driver. His hand was trembling slightly. It was a small movement, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely, but it was there. His fingers brushed against the bills, and he tried to steady them against the cold counter. "1 second, please," the cashier said, his voice cracking in the middle of the sentence. He sounded hoarse, like he had been shouting or holding back tears for hours. He cleared his throat awkwardly, turning his head away to punch an order into the register. The driver in the car sat quietly, watching. He didn't tap his fingers on the steering wheel impatiently. He didn't check his watch. He just watched. He saw the way the young man's shoulders slumped forward, as if he was trying to make himself smaller, to disappear into the background. He saw the way the cashier kept wiping his hands on his apron, a nervous habit. As the cashier waited for the machine to authorize the transaction, the chaos inside seemed to get louder. Someone dropped a metal scoop in the back, and it made a terrible crashing sound. The cashier jumped visibly, his whole body flinching at the noise. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second, taking a deep, shaky breath. When he opened his eyes again, they were swimming with tears. He tried to blink them away, looking up at the ceiling as if he could push the tears back down by sheer force of will. He turned back to the window to hand over the change. His eyes met the eyes of the driver for just a moment. It was a fleeting connection, two strangers looking at each other through a piece of glass. Usually, these interactions take less than 10 seconds. You take the money, you give the food, and you move on. But this time, something hung in the air. The cashier's face crumpled. It was like a dam breaking. He had been holding it together for so long, trying to be strong, trying to do his job despite the bad night and the yelling and the exhaustion. But in that quiet moment, looking at a customer who wasn't looking at a watch or a phone, he couldn't keep the mask on. A single tear escaped, rolling down his cheek and getting caught in the stubble on his chin. He quickly turned his head to the side, pretending to look for a straw or a napkin, and roughly wiped his face with the sleeve of his uniform. It was a desperate, angry gesture, like he was mad at himself for crying. "I am so sorry," the young man whispered, mostly to himself, but the microphone picked it up. He sniffled hard, his chest heaving once. Just give me a minute." He was embarrassed, humiliated. Here he was, at his job, crying in front of a customer. He felt like a failure. He felt like everyone in the restaurant was staring at him, judging him. He could feel the heat rising in his neck and face. He just wanted the shift to end. He wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and pull the covers over his head. He wanted to disappear. The driver didn't look away. He didn't shift his gaze uncomfortably or pretend he didn't see it. He saw the struggle. He saw the raw, human pain right there in front of him. It wasn't about a burger or fries anymore. It wasn't about being a celebrity or a stranger. It was about a person who was hurting. The driver noticed that the cashier's hands were shaking so badly now that he was having trouble counting out the coins for the change. The coins were slipping through his fingers, clicking onto the counter and rolling away. It was a small disaster, but to the young man, it felt like the end of the world. He let out a tiny, frustrated sob, hanging his head. The manager swept by behind him, saying something about the timer on the drive-thru running too long. "We need to move the line." The voice snapped. The cashier flinched again, his shoulders shaking. He was trapped between the pressure of the job and the overwhelming emotions crashing down on him. He felt alone in a crowded room. He felt like he was drowning on dry land. He grabbed a napkin, blew his nose quickly, and tried to compose himself. He grabbed the drink cup, his knuckles white as he gripped it tight. He turned back to the window, his eyes watery and red, his face blotchy. He looked down, avoiding eye contact now, terrified of what the driver might say. Would he complain? Would he make a rude comment? Would he ask for a manager? The cashier braced himself for more cruelty. He expected the driver to be annoyed, to honk the horn, or to yell at him to hurry up. That was how the night had gone so far. Why would this be any different? He pushed the drink out through the window, his arm trembling. "Here," he mumbled, his voice thick and shaky. I'm sorry for the wait." He stood there, waiting for the reaction, shrinking into his uniform, wishing the ground would just open up and swallow him whole. The air coming out of the window was hot and smelled of grease, mixing with the cool night breeze and creating a fog between them. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, a moment where the actor in the car saw not a service worker, but a human being pushed to the very edge. The cashier didn't know it yet, but this interaction was about to take a turn he never expected. The driver wasn't reaching for his food. He was reaching out with something far more important. He was about to show that he saw him, really saw him, and that he wasn't going to drive away and leave him there in the dark alone. The brown paper bag sat on the passenger seat, the smell of salty fries and a grilled patty filling the small space of the car. It was exactly what he had asked for, a simple meal to end a long day. In any normal situation, this is the moment where the transaction ends. The driver takes the food. The foot comes off the brake. The car rolls forward, and life moves on. The cashier turns to the next screen, the next customer, and the moment is forgotten. But tonight, the car did not move. The brake light stayed illuminated, casting two red glows on the wet pavement behind the vehicle. Inside the car, the driver sat with his hands still resting on the steering wheel. He was looking at the empty space where the cashier had been standing just a second ago. The young man had retreated into the shadows of the kitchen, wiping his face with his sleeve, trying desperately to pull himself together before he had to face another customer. The interaction had been brief, maybe 30 seconds long, but it had left a heavy mark on the driver's mind. He could feel the tension in his own chest, a mirror of what he had seen in the young man. He knew that look. He knew the specific body language of someone who is trying very hard not to fall apart in public. It was the look of a person holding up a sky that felt too heavy for their shoulders. He knew that life has a way of piling things on you until you feel like you can't breathe. Sometimes it's big things, like a loss that changes you forever. And sometimes it's 100 small things that break you all at once, like a demanding boss, a long shift, a flat tire, and a lonely apartment, all waiting for you at the end of the night. Behind him, the silence of the night was broken. A car horn honked. It was a sharp, aggressive sound that cut through the air. Honk, honk, then another. The driver in the car behind was getting impatient. To them, this was just a delay. It was a car that wasn't moving fast enough, an obstacle between them and their dinner. They didn't know what was happening at the window. They didn't see the tears. They just saw brake lights. The noise usually made people rush. It made people anxious. It made drivers step on the gas to get away from the anger. But the man in the hood didn't flinch. He didn't look in the rearview mirror with annoyance. He didn't apologize and speed off. Instead, he sat there, grounded and calm. He let the noise wash over him, choosing to ignore the pressure of the world behind him to focus on the human being in front of him. He looked back toward the open window. The kitchen noise was still loud, banging metal, shouting voices, the hum of fans. But there was a gap in the flow. The cashier was gone. The driver leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. He saw the young man standing by the soda machine, his back turned to the window. His shoulders were shaking, just slightly. He was taking a moment, a stolen second, to try and breathe through the pain. It would have been so easy to drive away. It would have been the logical thing to do. He had his food. He was a stranger. Why get involved? Why complicate a simple night? But the driver felt a pull, a deep instinct that he couldn't ignore. He knew that sometimes, the smallest act of noticing someone can change their whole day. He knew that kindness isn't always about big gestures or donating millions of dollars. Sometimes, kindness is just refusing to look away when someone is hurting. He reached over to the gear shift and moved the car into park. The simple mechanical click was loud in the quiet of the car. He was committing to this moment. He was making a choice to stop the forward motion of his life, to pause for someone else. The honking from behind got louder, more insistent. The person behind was probably rolling their eyes, maybe shouting inside their own car. But the driver in the front didn't care. He wasn't going to let the anger of a stranger dictate his actions. He looked into the side mirror and saw the cashier slowly turning back around. The young man had wiped his face and was trying to put his professional mask back on. He looked like he was bracing himself for the worst. He probably thought the customer was waiting to complain. He probably thought the car was still there because the order was wrong, or because the driver was angry about the wait. The fear in his eyes was obvious. He was expecting more conflict, more stress, more reasons to feel small. The driver waited until the young man's eyes met his. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his hands. He just sat there, a calm presence in the storm of the night. He raised one hand, slowly and gently, palm open. It wasn't a wave to say goodbye. It was a signal to wait. It was a signal to say, "Stay here, I am not leaving yet." The cashier looked confused. He hesitated, standing a few feet away from the counter. He pointed at himself, mouthing the words, "Me?" The driver nodded. "Yes, you." The atmosphere between the car and the window shifted. The fast-paced energy of the drive-thru seemed to pause in this little bubble. The cashier stepped closer to the ledge, but he kept his hands folded in front of him, a defensive posture. He looked terrified. He had been yelled at enough times tonight to know that usually, when a customer waits like this, it's not to give a compliment. The driver took a deep breath. He knew he had to be careful. He knew that a sudden movement or a loud voice could send the young man retreating again. He needed to bridge the gap between the two worlds, the world of the famous actor in the car and the world of the struggling worker in the window. He needed to speak, but not as a celebrity speaking to a fan. He needed to speak as a human being speaking to a human being. He could feel his own heart beating a little faster. It is a brave thing to offer kindness to a stranger who is suffering. It makes you vulnerable. It opens you up to rejection or indifference. But he knew that the fear of being awkward was a small price to pay if it meant he could help lift even a fraction of the weight from that young man's shoulders. The noise from the car behind reached a fever pitch. A long, continuous blare of the horn. It was ugly and demanding. The cashier flinched again at the sound, his face scrunching up like he was expecting a blow. But the driver in the car didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked on the cashier, his gaze steady and soft. He was blocking out the world. In this moment, there was no one else on the planet but the two of them. The horn was just background noise, the irrelevant buzzing of a world that was always in a hurry. The driver leaned his arm on the edge of the car door, getting closer to the window. He knew he didn't have much time before a manager came over to see what was holding up the line. He knew he had to act. He wasn't going to drive away and leave this young man alone in the dark with his tears. He was going to ask a simple question. A question that might seem small, but that would open the door to something much bigger. He was about to step out of his role as a customer and into his role as a fellow human being. The pause in the night was just long enough for a connection to be made, a bridge to be built across the counter. He wasn't just a man in a car anymore, and the other person wasn't just a cashier. They were just two people, alive together, in the middle of a hard night. The young cashier stepped closer to the window, but he kept his body tense, ready for a harsh word or a complaint. The honking from the car behind was relentless now, a loud, angry rhythm that made the air vibrate. It was the soundtrack of the modern world, everyone rushing, everyone demanding, nobody waiting. But the man in the car didn't turn his head. He didn't flinch at the noise. He kept his eyes locked on the cashier's face, his gaze soft and steady, cutting right through the tension. When the cashier was close enough, the driver leaned forward, resting his arms on the ledge of the car door. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at the young man for a moment, taking in the redness of his eyes and the way his lip trembled. It was a look that said, "I see you. I really see you." "Hey," the driver said quietly. His voice was deep and calm, like a low thrum that was louder than the shouting manager inside or the honking cars outside. "The order is fine. You didn't do anything wrong." The cashier blinked, surprised. He had opened his mouth to apologize, to offer a discount, to do whatever he needed to do to defuse the situation. But the words got stuck in his throat. He wasn't used to gentleness. "Not here. Not tonight. The cashier started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, trying to find his composure. "I'm sorry about the wait. It's been a really bad night. I'm sorry I'm crying." The driver shook his head slowly, a small, understanding smile touching the corners of his mouth. He didn't look annoyed by the tears. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked like he understood exactly what it felt like to want to cry in the middle of a busy day. "Don't apologize," the driver said. "We all have those nights. We all have moments where it feels like everything is just too heavy. Are you okay? I mean, really, okay?" It was such a simple question. 3 words. "Are you okay?" But it hit the cashier like a wave. Most people didn't ask that. They asked for ketchup. They asked for extra napkins. They asked for the manager. They didn't ask about his heart. The cashier looked down at the counter, then back up at the stranger. For a second, the mask slipped completely. The weight of the last few weeks, the rent that was due, the family issues, the exhaustion of working double shifts, The feeling of being invisible came crashing down on him all at once. He didn't pour out his whole life story, because there wasn't time. But he didn't have to. His eyes told the story. I'm tired, the young man admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I feel like I'm drowning a little bit. Everything is going wrong, and I can't seem to catch a break. I didn't mean to lose it out here. The driver nodded. He didn't offer fake positivity. He didn't say, don't worry, be happy. He didn't say, it could be worse. He just offered validation. He reached his hand through the window and patted the cashier on the shoulder. It was a firm, grounding touch. A human touch. I hear you, the driver said. And you're doing a good job. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now. You're working. You're standing. That counts for a lot. It's going to be okay. I know it feels like the end of the world right now, but it's not. You're going to get through this shift, and you're going to go home, and tomorrow is a new start. You just have to hang in there. Hearing those words, spoken with such sincerity, seemed to let the air back into the cashier's lungs. The panic in his chest loosened, just a little bit. It felt strange to be comforted by a stranger in a drive-through lane, but it was exactly what he needed. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark water he was treading. The driver pulled his hand back and reached into the pocket of his hoodie. He wasn't grabbing a wallet to pay for the burger, he had already done that. He pulled out a thick fold of cash. It wasn't just a single dollar bill for a tip. It was a substantial amount of money, enough to mean something, enough to cover groceries or a bill, or a night off, where he didn't have to worry about money for a few hours. He held it out through the window. The cashier looked at the money, confused, his eyes going wide. He shook his head quickly, putting his hands up. No, the cashier stammered. I can't take that. You already paid. I didn't do anything to deserve that. You're working hard, the driver said, pushing the money gently toward the cashier's hand. Take it, please. Don't argue with me. Treat yourself to a decent meal tonight. Or save it for something that makes you happy. Just take it. The cashier looked at the driver, trying to understand. Was this a prank? Was this guy crazy? But when he looked into those eyes, he didn't see madness. He saw kindness. He saw a man who had known pain and didn't want anyone else to feel it if he could help it. Slowly, hesitantly, the cashier reached out and took the money. His fingers brushed against the driver's hand, which was warm and rough. The cash felt heavy in his hand, real and solid. Thank you, the cashier whispered, the tears welling up again, but this time, they were different. They weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of gratitude. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, the driver replied softly. Just remember what I said. Hang in there. It gets better. You're stronger than you think you are. Behind the car, the honking had turned into a continuous roar. Another car had pulled up behind the honker, adding to the chaos. The manager was walking toward the window now, looking angry, pointing at his watch. The moment was shattering, the real world trying to push its way back in. But for these few seconds, there had been a bubble of peace. The driver looked at the manager, then back at the cashier. He gave a small, knowing nod, as if to say, don't let him get to you. The driver squeezed the cashier's hand one last time around the money. A silent transfer of strength. He had done what he came to do. He hadn't just bought dinner. He had bought a moment of hope for someone who needed it. He hadn't tried to save the world. He had just tried to make one small corner of it a little less dark. The cashier gripped the money tightly, feeling a spark of warmth inside him that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. He felt seen. He felt valued. And for the first time all night, he felt like he could actually breathe. The angry manager was now standing right next to the cashier, his face flushed red, shouting about the timer and the line of cars that was stretching out into the street. The noise was aggressive, piercing through the quiet bubble that had formed for just a few minutes. The driver saw this happening. He knew the magic moment was breaking. The real world, with its rules and its impatience, was pushing its way back in. He didn't want to cause any more trouble for the young man, who had already been through enough. The driver nodded one last time, a slow, deliberate movement. It was a goodbye, but also a promise. He shifted his foot from the brake to the gas pedal. The car gave a gentle lurch as it rolled forward, inching away from the window. As he moved, he raised a hand in a simple wave, not the frantic wave of someone in a hurry, but a calm, parting gesture. He didn't look back at the angry manager. He didn't look at the long line of cars behind him. He kept his eyes forward on the dark road ahead. The cashier watched the car pull away. He stood there for a second, frozen, his hand still gripping the money the stranger had given him. The glass window slid shut, cutting off the cool night air and sealing him back inside the hot, greasy kitchen. The noise of the restaurant rushed back in like a tidal wave, the frying, the beeping, the shouting. But it sounded different now. It didn't feel like a crushing weight anymore. He felt a strange sense of calm in the middle of the storm. The manager was still talking, pointing a finger at the screen, demanding to know why the order had taken so long. Usually, this would have made the cashier panic. Usually, he would have stammered and felt his heart race. But this time, he took a deep breath. He looked at his manager, then down at the thick fold of cash in his hand. He felt the crisp paper against his skin. He thought about the stranger's voice, telling him he was strong, telling him it was going to be okay. "I'm sorry," the cashier said to his manager, his voice steady and clear. "I'm back on it now. Let's get this line moving." He put the money safely into his pocket, close to his heart. He turned back to the next car, a forced smile coming to his face. But for the first time that night, the smile felt a little bit more real. He wasn't drowning anymore. He had been thrown a life preserver, and he was going to hold on to it. Meanwhile, the car drove further and further away from the bright lights of the restaurant. The driver merged onto the main road, the engine humming softly. He was alone again in the quiet cab of his vehicle. The city streets were mostly empty now, the streetlights flashing by in a rhythmic blur. He reached over and picked up a cold French fry from the bag on the seat next to him and ate it. It was salty and a bit soggy, but it tasted good. It tasted like peace. He didn't feel a need to call anyone and tell them what he had done. He didn't want to post about it on social media. He didn't want a pat on the back. He just felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He knew that for that young man, the night might still be hard, and the tomorrow might still bring struggles. Money doesn't fix everything, and neither do kind words. But he also knew that sometimes, a single moment of kindness can be the thing that keeps a person going. It can be the proof that the world isn't entirely cold. He thought about the look on the cashier's face when he realized he wasn't going to be yelled at. He thought about the relief in his eyes. That was worth more than any award he had ever won. That was real. The car slowed down as it approached a red light. In the lane next to him, a taxi driver was looking over, curious. The driver in the hoodie just kept his eyes forward, his face hidden by the shadow of his cap. He was anonymous again, just another person driving home in the dark. Nobody in the other cars knew that a small act of humanity had just taken place a few miles back. They were all just moving pieces in the busy machine of the city. The light turned green. He pressed the gas, and the car moved forward, disappearing into the flow of traffic. The rear taillights grew smaller and smaller in the distance, eventually turning a corner and vanishing completely. Back at the restaurant, the shift finally ended. The clock struck midnight, and the open sign was turned off. The young cashier walked out into the cool night air, pulling his jacket tight around him. He was exhausted, his feet ached, and his eyes were still tired. But as he walked toward the bus stop, he reached into his pocket and touched the money the stranger had given him. He remembered the voice that told him to hang in there. He looked up at the stars, visible through the gaps in the city skyline, and took a deep breath of the fresh air. He felt a little lighter. He felt like he could make it home. He felt like maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be a better day. The driver never knew the cashier's name, and the cashier never knew the driver was a famous movie star. And that was exactly how it should have been. It wasn't a story about a fan and an idol. It was a story about two human beings who crossed paths at the exact moment one of them needed help. It was a reminder that you don't need to be rich or powerful to make a difference. You just need to care enough to stop. You just need to see the person behind the uniform, the tears, or the smile. The city went back to sleep, and the sun would rise in a few hours, bringing a new day for both of them. But the memory of those few minutes at the drive-through window would stay with them both, a silent, invisible bond formed in the glow of a fast food sign on a Tuesday night. The driver disappeared into the anonymity he loved, leaving behind a trail of hope that was far more filling than any meal he could have bought. And in the end, that was the greatest role he ever played, just being a decent human being.